Stand by for broadcast.
You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hello, I'm Squadron Leader Peter Lisney, and in this episode we hear from one of the RAF's first female fast jet pilots. We'll also have an operational update in reheat. But first, see if you can identify this noise. Find out if you're right at the end of this episode. Now, Mandy Hickson is a former fast jet pilot and lived through part of the RAF's journey to becoming more inclusive. She spoke with our correspondent Flying Officer Amy Casey about her experiences as a tornado pilot on a frontline squadron.
My biggest fear was letting my team down, without a doubt. It wasn't getting shot at, it wasn't what would happen if. That was sort of something that I just put to the back of my mind, actually. It was a contaminated runway, and when I applied my thrust reverse, one of my wheels were aquaplaned through 90 degrees, and we started going sideways, slightly backwards down the runway to about 160 miles an hour. The way we can work most efficiently is when we bring our true selves to work. And the way that we're going to get that is, diversity is what we have, inclusivity is what we do with it. Amy, it's lovely to be here to join you. And so my name's Mandy, and I was the second woman that flew the Tornado GR4 on the front line. So I think that's my claim to fame in life. So yeah, I did 17 years serving in the RAF, and I left 11 years ago and then joined the Volunteer Reserves. And I then did a further 8 years with them flying air cadets. And I stopped that just before lockdown, actually, just because life was becoming a bit busy with 2 teenage boys as well. And in that time when I left, I also run my own business and have written my own book.
It is quite a career when you look back over some of the extraordinary things that you've done. And we say that now because we're lucky enough and we're in a situation where we're walking around, and to see a fast jet pilot who also happens to be a woman, it's not as unusual as what it was in your day.
Yeah.
So can you maybe tell me a little bit about the start of your career into the Royal Air Force?
When I was first interested in doing it, Amy, women weren't allowed to be pilots in the Air Force. And then as I continued sort of through my air cadets journey, at the age of sort of 14 through to 18, women were then accepted to be pilots in the Air Force, but not on the front line as fast jet pilots. I was then awarded a flying scholarship. From there, I gained a private pilot's license, went off to university and joined the wonderful University Air Squadrons, which I still always talk about with such fond regard, because I think it's a really great stepping stone for anybody that doesn't know if they want to join the forces. And it's just a really great sounding place to say, is this something that would fit with me? Does my personality type work? And it really did for myself, because once I joined the University Air Squadron, I was absolutely desperate to join. And I did about 160 hours of flying while I was there. And it was in my second year at uni when they changed the rules, allowing females to fly on the front line of fast jet operations. So I applied to join, and I then failed all of the aptitude tests, not once, but twice, which was not particularly impressive. Because it was a stage when they were just opening the doors to women, actually there was a huge proportion of women that were taking the tests were failing them compared to men. And actually, with a lot of support from my boss of my University Air Squadron, a guy called Carl Bufton, who was an absolute superstar, and he really went above and beyond and started to challenge the system. He got examiners to come and fly with me from Central Flying School, and they all sort of graded me as above average. And then we had a case to basically make to say, what about taking her on and seeing if she can fly, even though she can't pass the aptitude tests? And they initially took me on as an air traffic controller. And then after a bit of persuasion and a lot of letters, and it also being escalated through the ranks, eventually I got a branch change across to pilot. And that's where the story began.
You talk about those aptitude tests and failing those, and that was the nail in the coffin for you progressing further at that stage. But I really want to highlight, at this stage, you had a huge amount of hours flying underneath your belt. And also, you had a cupboard full of silverware. You were out flying RAF pilots at this stage, but still having to push through because of these aptitude tests. I can't imagine how frustrating that was.
Yeah, it was frustrating actually, and I always say I'm not any better. And any women who are joining the Air Force will say, well, I'm not better than the men in any way, shape, or form. It's probably that you have to work a little bit harder to have got there. And I certainly was never a better pilot than many of the guys that I was up against, and I was certainly who I was going through training with. I did win quite a few awards for leadership throughout my time in, and I did win an aerobatics competition when I was at university as well, which was against male-sponsored pilots. So there was sort of quite a good case really at that point to be, on my side. And I did have a lot of hours. I mean, my goodness, I don't think I did much of my degree actually, if I'm really honest. I just spent the whole time just flying. But it was where my passion lay. And I just think it was when I was put up to fly in this aerobatics competition against 3 other university air squadrons. And it was right before my finals. And I just remember thinking, yeah, well, if I win the competition, then I've got such a better case to make for the Air Force. I was already sponsored by then as an air traffic controller for my final year at uni. And I just thought, I've got a job in the Air Force. So actually, what difference is it going to make if I get a first, a second, or whatever sort of type of degree? So, yeah, I went for the flying option.
It seemed like your career, it was a bit of a constant battle. We're going to touch on that a little bit later on, but I want to come to the fact that you were flying in combat. How did that feel to be one of the first women in a combat role?
I don't think we ever really thought, and I know that Joe Salton and myself, we were sort of quite similar in this one, and we've talked about it, quite a few times since. We were doing it, but we were just part of the squadron, and we were never sort of thinking of ourselves as, oh, here we are with the first, with the second. It was just that you were part of the squadron. And I think that's the mentality that you needed to have. I mean, my biggest fear was letting my team down, without a doubt. It wasn't getting shot at. It wasn't what would happen if. That was sort of something that I just put to the back of my mind, actually. It was more, you just want to be part of that team of people that are going off to do the job that you've been employed to do.
Was there a support network available to you, or was that just heavily leaning on the squadron and others who were in your circle?
Yeah, there wasn't really at the time. And I know this is something that's changed massively in the military, as it has in society as a whole. 25 years ago, we didn't talk about mental health, and, it just wasn't really mentioned. There was this thing of PTSD, but no one really talked about it. And the military have really got a grip of that so much more since. And there's still more to do. I always believe there will be more to do. But as in a support network, I mean, we didn't really have any other female role models to be looking up towards at that time. In all truth, I just don't think the military was quite ready for bringing women in at that stage. I mean, they changed the rules, but then they changed nothing within the system, like no female toilets, no female flying kit. There was nothing that had actually changed that would sort of say, oh, we're welcoming you with our, arms open here. And so there was no real support, as in people to talk to about anything. And I don't think I'd really appreciated just how tough I would probably find it when I got out to the Gulf, being the only woman out there. And in my latter tour, I did have another female navigator that arrived on my squadron, Helen. And at least we had a little bit of a female, camaraderie. But in that first tour particular, I think it just sort of shocked me a bit just how tough I found it, having no other females to speak to.
As far as failing the aptitude tests going into the Royal Air Force, you were put in a position where you were almost like an experiment, weren't you, Mandy? They didn't expect you to be continuing on this path. They certainly didn't think that you were going to be flying operationally. When you look back, how does that make you feel?
Well, quite privileged, actually, that I was given that chance, because I think it would have been very easy for the Air Force just to sort of think, no, it doesn't come within our process. That's not what happens. If you fail the test, then you can't be taken on. But I think at least they had the foresight to say, actually, let's look at the detail. Hold on a minute. Why is it so many women are failing the test compared to men? So it's obviously that there was some sort of unconscious bias within the testing that had never come to light, because they'd never been tested on women. So there was no malice in there. The fact that I was taken on as this test case was sort of really came to light when my great friend Ness, she was doing her dissertation. They basically, she went off to the College Cranwell, to the selection centre, and they showed her all these stats, and they said, we've taken on this test case. And she was like, oh my gosh, that's one of my best friends. And it was obviously came back to me sort of secondhand. And I thought, oh my gosh, that's fascinating. What was interesting then, though, to be honest, Amy, was once I'd had that conversation with Ness and she told me this, and I started to think about it, then I started to plant that seed of doubt of really, was I good enough? And I think that was something that I don't think I'd really truly appreciated at the time, because I never used to sort of suffer from sort of self-doubt and imposter syndrome. And then I think really from that moment onwards, I started, if you would struggle, you'd think, oh, is this because I'm not good enough? Oh, is this because I didn't pass the tests? So rather than just always having this really positive outlook and thinking, oh, yes, I'll be fine, there was always that seed of doubt in the back of my mind.
I want to talk about some of your career highlights in just a minute, but whilst we're talking about combat when you were flying in the Middle East, what was it like, that moment that you came under fire? I mean, I've listened to it in your book and the way that the training kicked in. Was there any thought process, or was it just literally the ABCs of your training that you lent on in that situation?
Well, I do think that's where the training you get in lots of different branches, but, particularly as a pilot, everything is done procedurally, and you have trained and trained and trained. And there's a really good reason for that. Is because when things do go wrong, you are just going back not onto automatic pilot. It's more than that. You're immediately, hands are going in the right places. Just say the words, brake right, and instantly you're carrying out a maneuver that, again, you've practiced together as a team before. And I always think it's fascinating, actually, the way that our brain works. So, there was another incident where I was, I don't know if you remember, when I was in Goose Bay and I was skidding down a runway.
I want to expand on that, because that was one of the bits in your book where I was just like, oh my God, I had to pull over the car so I could sit there and listen to the story. If you don't mind, I'll just get you to explain the Goose Bay incident.
Goose Bay basically is up in northern Canada, in Labrador, and it's a really quite a tricky airfield to fly from. And at the time, it has a really wide runway, and half of it was smooth and half of it was ridged. And it was done deliberately because they often get some really extreme weather. And they say, if it's really, really bad weather, for example, we would call it a contaminated runway. Like if you're going down a motorway, for example, you start aquaplaning when you put your brakes on. It's that skidding motion. So they ridged half of it to prevent that from happening. And they always said, if you come back in bad weather, just land on the ridge side. I was very few hours on the jet. I think we had 30 hours flying tornadoes, and we were on the operational conversion unit, and we had deployed out to Canada because a slot had become available. And I think all the staff had gone, yeah, why not? Why wouldn't we take you up on this fantastic opportunity? So we'd gone out to Canada and we were doing air combat out there. And myself and a fantastic friend of mine, Rob, we were doing some merges, so coming together in air combat. And we were pushing the limits with regards to our fuel consumption, because we had to get a last merge in to get the trip to count towards our training requirements. And so we were on sort of our minimum fuel, and they suddenly changed the weather state back at the base, and they called us back and they said the huge thunderstorms going through, and suddenly all of our diversions were not looking good. And basically at this point I was coming through thick cloud, and it was almost that error chain. We often talk about these faint whisperings, when things start to go wrong, you think, oh no, that gut feeling in your stomach when you think something's going wrong. And it's these faint whisperings all coming together. And it's that whole, have you got the capacity to break your error chain at that point? And I obviously did not, because I was very inexperienced. Air traffic control said to us, would we accept a talk down through the cloud, so an instrument approach with a student air traffic controller? And I said yes, which was another foolish thing to do, because I should have said, no, actually, can I have some really experience to get me down? And when I came out of cloud, I was at about 250 feet, and we were not lined up by the runway. We were lined up on the apron where all the aircraft were lined up. And I thought, right, minimal fuel, right, need to get it on the runway. And I broke right, got it down on the runway and landed it straight on the centre line, which would in normal terms be perfect. However, it was a contaminated runway. And when I applied my thrust reverse, one of my wheels aquaplaned through 90 degrees, and we started going sideways, slightly backwards down the runway to about 160 miles an hour. And it was not a good situation to be in. And my navigator shouted, I'm not ejecting yet. At this point, which was horrific. But the other thing that he said was loss of directional control on the runway. And that is a drill. The second his voice said loss of directional control, I instantly went in the simulator, cancel thrust first, bring the throttles back to idle. And my brain went into the sorting out the drill for that maneuver. And again, that goes back to your training. If you just said, oh my goodness, we're slipping, it wouldn't have been that trigger for you then to do the actions. And I think that's why it's so important. That's why when we talk about aviation as a whole, we have very standard phrases that we use. It's why you can have different people flying with different crews daily, because you're all using absolutely standardized phraseology. And so you can mix your crews up quite well because everyone knows what they're talking about.
As well, whilst you were hurtling down this runway at 160 mile an hour with your nav saying, I'm not going to eject just yet, you were actually hurtling towards another aircraft at the end of the runway as well, weren't you?
Yeah, well, it was a German tornado and it had gone off the runway about a week before and was literally inverted at the bottom of the runway. And it was just like, oh my goodness. There do seem to be quite a few incidents out in Goose Bay. Well, there certainly used to be. And a lot of it was around visual illusions and things like that, because you'd be flying over forests and you would be flying at very low level called operational low flying, where we can go down to 100 feet. And we'd be doing really quite complex sorties out there. Your radio altimeter, your radalt, which measures your height directly out the bottom of your jet, which bounces off the floor and comes back up and tells you how high are you above the ground. So it's not tied into things like sea, temperatures and pressures and sea level and things. It could be quite erratic at that height. And so you did it on a visual picture. And when we're flying along, I was visually putting myself, 30, 40 feet above the treetops. And it was only afterwards when we sort of realised that this was an entire forest of brand new saplings that had just been planted, which were no bigger than our Christmas tree at home. And we were just seeing the tops of them. We thought that was the tops of them. That was the whole of them. And so we potentially could have been down at about 50 feet, which, at 600 miles an hour is pretty scary, really.
Oh, my goodness me. You must have given some bears a bit of what for when you were flying.
I know, exactly. But these are the sorts of things they were trying to train about, all these visual illusions that you get and all the different dangers that could be. And it's only when you're flying over there, you suddenly, because it's a huge, vast forest as well. So it's not like just sort of like the UK where we've got a small forest. These were going on for miles and miles as far as the eye could see. So, yeah, it was challenging, actually.
Such an extensive career. And I mean, I think we've touched on a few of the lowlights. I mean, the Goose Bay incident, honestly, it makes the hairs on my arm stand up. But if you could think about highlights, Mandy, I know there must be many, but could you pick out a couple for me?
The day that I graduated as an officer was one of the highlights there because, and I talk about him in my book, but my grandpa was one of my role models and he was a pilot in the Second World War and then remained in the Air Force actually as a wing commander and went through as a policeman to see out the rest of his career. And on his 90th birthday, it was the day I graduated. I mean, the 6th of April, who'd have thought his actual birthday? He was 90 that day, and the Air Force invited him as the guest of honour instead of a high-ranking officer, and he was the one that handed out the awards. And it was just a really wonderful. He didn't hand any to me, by the way, which was slightly sad. But it was just what a day for our family to have my granny and my grandpa on my graduation day. So that was a real highlight. And I think the day I gained my RAF wings as well. So flying a 9-ship of Hawk aircraft over your family and friends. And the video I've got footage is fantastic because I think my dad's recording it on a video recorder. All I can hear him go, which one is Mandy? And there's all this lovely chat that's going on in the background of hearing what all the people on the ground are saying. And it's really funny. So yeah, that was another great day.
What a beautiful memory for your family. I absolutely love that. Let's have a look at diversity and inclusivity, especially the progression in the Royal Air Force, because throughout your time, I mean, you had to endure some pretty awful behaviour, from early OJAR reports claiming that you weren't feminine enough, to getting challenged by your CO for swearing whilst amongst your colleagues at a mess do, even the nickname that they gave you, Big Bird, all of these sorts of things. What changes in inclusivity do you see, Mandy?
Huge amounts, actually, Amy. And it's just, I feel quite proud of the Air Force, of the military as a whole. But I think it also obviously reflects what's been happening in society over the last 20 years. When we think about the culture that used to exist, from the catcalling, from the scaffolding, building sites to, these things have really, really stopped. And I think it's very hard to sometimes separate the lens between what has happened now and what was happening 25 years ago. In those days, I hate to say it was acceptable and it's not right, but it was just part and parcel to what went on. I didn't see myself as being hard done by. It's only really when I was looking through the lens of writing the book now, with what's happening in society now, that you think, oh my goodness, that was inappropriate. And I just think the military's changed Immeasurably. I was talking to, actually, it was the female navigator that I just alluded to earlier on, Helen. We had a Tornado aircrew reunion in London a couple of weeks ago. She's done some time in the army. She's done some time in the Air Force, obviously, and she's actually going to join, hopefully, the Met Police. And she said, it's really interesting seeing the different societies. And she said there are pockets, for example, in the police that have not caught up of where we are in the military. So I think we need to be really proud of ourselves and say, considering it's such a predominance of men still, I think it's about 12% women. You probably know better than I do on that number, Amy.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I think it's around 11 or 12% for regular, but just slightly higher for reservists.
Yeah, and you think, okay, so it's predominantly men, but actually we don't see that same amount of sexism. I mean, there has been a few reports done. I know that there was the Wigston report that was done just before, I think, that he took over as Chief of the Air Staff, where they looked at sexism, discrimination, bullying, any sorts of reporting and things like that. And I know that there has still been incidents of it, but it's definitely on the improvement. And I know that a really good friend of mine, Soraya Marshall, who's just taken over as AOC2 group, and she was Commandant at Cranwell, and she said to me, Mandy, you wouldn't believe just the whole difference in feeling of the place, of seeing so many more females coming through, especially in the aircrew cadre as well, which is great. She said it's just a different place. And I just think, well, that's fantastic to see. I really hope that the work that, myself and some of those pioneering female aviation professionals has actually made a difference and has made it easier for people to follow in our footsteps.
I want to touch on the difficult choice that you had to make between family and a career in the Royal Air Force. Even after all of your accomplishments, fast jet pilot, flown operationally, many, many hours of flying time under your belt, the skills that you could offer to the Royal Air Force, even on top of all of that, you were still put in a position where you had to choose between a family and a career. Do you think there have been suitable changes from when you had to make that difficult decision?
Yeah, there has actually, Amy. So that is the one thing I do look back with a sense of sorrow. Out of my entire career, there's not much I sort of regret or I feel, should have been done differently. But this area was an area that I did feel perhaps a little let down, that they couldn't see far enough ahead. You were one of very, very few women. And of course, the second that we'd had children, I was given two options, which was you're going straight back to the front line and the Tornado was deploying to Afghanistan, or you're going to RAF Valley as an instructor. And if that didn't fit into exactly where you could be in life. Now, I was married by then to a pilot who was flying out of Gatwick. And he couldn't just up and move his job because otherwise he wouldn't have had a job. So I would have been moving up to Valley as a single mum with a 4-month-old baby and a 20-month-old toddler. I just looked at that and thought, I can't do that. I had to make a really big choice. And I found a job that was at Boscombe Down near Salisbury, second line job, well within my rights to do it. But I was told if I took the job, I would never be promoted again. And I remember that really clearly in that phone call. Has it changed now? Absolutely. So return to work, taking sabbaticals, having time periods off, flexible working hours, working from home. And I think obviously COVID has sped up that process somewhat, but it's actually made people recognize that it can work, it does work. And actually, you might end up with some really much better quality and more experienced people that are going to come back into the Air Force, having had periods of time off, because there is that flexibility. And so I think it's becoming much, much more forward-looking in its entire outlook.
I want to lean into something here, and I don't even know if it's something that, we're supposed to talk about, but let me just put this to you, because in my role, I'm often talked to by friends in the mess, or I've even been approached by quite senior ranking officers, and they've said to me, I don't want to ever come across as sexist or misogynist or anything like that. And I feel like I'm getting it wrong. Now, I'll give you the examples that were given to me. In a social setting, a male friend of mine felt like he couldn't join in the conversation or put forward an opinion because he didn't want to cause any kind of offence. And when he told me what his opinions were, they were not offensive in the slightest. My second example is a senior ranking officer who's asked me, did I find it offensive when he held the door open for me? Because he'd actually been told off by a civilian woman in New York. So I guess in a very uneloquent way, how do we make inclusivity inclusive for everybody?
It's a really hard one, though, to be honest, Amy. And I know why you're struggling with it, because this is a conversation I have with my husband all the time, who just says, he's a really lovely guy. And he just says, I feel like I'm getting it wrong. I just feel like we can't get it right now. Anything we say is wrong.
Yes.
And I just think it's really tough. And so we don't want to isolate. These are the guys that are making up the majority of the services. The majority of them are trying so hard. And I actually have that as well myself. I was speaking at a girls' school and I just said morning girls. And I was told, actually, Mandy, can you not say morning girls? Could you be more inclusive? Could you say morning everyone? Because some of the girls might not be identifying as girls at the moment. And that is absolutely fine. But again, it was me not meaning to not be inclusive, but just not thinking about it. So we're constantly having to think about it. And then I felt terrible. I then felt really guilty. I thought, oh my goodness, I should be right at the front of thinking differently. And yet we're still not. So I do know why it's difficult, because this is a difficult conversation. And I think a lot of people are struggling with, it's not just about being woke. Of course it's not. It's way more than that. It's about inclusivity, but it's about getting to the point whereby it's very natural for us to be inclusive, where people are not offended if we use the wrong turn of phrase occasionally. We're not doing it deliberately. I think that's the really important thing.
Do you feel like it should be an internal journey as much as it is external?
Yeah, I do actually. I think we do need to be sensitive though as well. And it's just a very difficult conversation that a lot of people are having at the moment and trying to get it right. And we are all trying to get it right. But the one thing I'd say there is it's that unconscious bias. We don't mean to put it on there. So a classic would be, I went skiing with a bunch of girls recently and we got on the airplane and there was a female captain. And we were all sitting separately on the airplane and nearly all 16 women texted me and went, a female pilot. And I just thought, that's part of that unconscious bias, is that we're still surprised. We're still feeling the need to comment when something's different. The one message I would always say is the way we can work most efficiently is when we bring our true selves to work. And the way that we're going to get that is, diversity is what we have. Inclusivity is what we do with it. And all we can keep on doing is striving in the future, internally and externally, to be as inclusive in our own minds and in our actions as well. So even if I, for example, catch myself out by going, oh gosh, it's a woman, or oh gosh, it's actually don't be biased and make a mental note and think, oh, I was just biased then, because I'm just as guilty as the rest of them. We all are. A lot of it's about that self-awareness as well. And I just had a really honest conversation with a friend of mine that I served on the Squadron with, and he read my book. And this Tornado Aircrew reunion, I was really nervous when I went there because I just thought, oh gosh, I'm going to be judged, or, I haven't seen anyone since I've published the book. And they all came up to me, but this one guy just said to me, Mandy, I was probably part of that team that put you into the room in, for example, in Ali Al Salem in Kuwait, which had all the pornography on the wall. And we just thought it was funny. And he said, do you know what? I never would have thought about it until I read your book. And that's all I can say, is that by talking about stuff and actually by pulling out behaviours, he said, you didn't write in that as a victim. You wrote just really honestly what had happened. And it makes people think about it. And he just said, I've really made me reflect on my behaviours. And he was one of my great friends, and he was a real supporter of me on the Squadron. So it wasn't that he was doing anything against me at all, but it was just that unconscious side of things that we do. And so I think it's about that awareness and actually reflecting back when things do happen.
Let's talk about the career pivot. So becoming an author, a motivational speaker, and putting all of your incredible stories into one place, an officer, not a gentleman. How did it all come about?
When I first left the Air Force, I did all my commercial pilot's licenses because that's what everyone did. And then a rather fortuitous conversation at a dinner party, someone suggested I go into the world of speaking because I was sharing a story, the Break Right story from a book. And I was a bit drunk, I think. And basically they went, my gosh, this would make a great motivational speech. And I sort of went, what is one of those? Because I just don't think, I'd been in the Air Force for 17 years. I didn't know what that was really. We didn't particularly have many speakers, and it wasn't something that we used to see much of, I think. It's something we see more and more of now. I started doing it and I just realised very, very soon into starting to do some presentations. Basically, the business took off, excuse the pun, and I just couldn't believe how it was growing year on year. But the one question I got asked at the end of every single speech was, have you written a book? And I started off by saying, no, I'm not a writer. No, I couldn't possibly. One big thing I really learned was when we say no, it shuts the door. But as soon as the second I started saying not yet, it was almost like I cracked that door open a tiny bit. And then you start opening yourself up to a world of possibility. I started jotting down a few stories and a few bits that I'd been talking about. And basically, An Officer, Not a Gentleman was born. And initially, it was rejected by all the publishing houses. But I think I may be allowed to say it, but I'm about to sign a publishing deal to actually have it republished by a publishing house, which is really exciting. And maybe looking at doing book number 2. So watch this space.
Do you have a motto, or what is your advice for staying positive when things are getting quite tough?
I've got 2 actually, Amy, that I like. So my entire mantra, and it's this one that, when I left the Air Force, it's the one we first came up with, and it's like, dream it, believe it, and do it. Because I always say, we have dreams and they can be really big, they can be out there. If you don't believe it, they're not going to go anywhere. So if you start to visualize it and see it happening, but if you don't put things into action, it's going nowhere. So hence the dream it, believe it, but do it. And that's the action point. And the other one that I use all the time, I use this in my daily life, it's control the controllables. And if you can't, let it go. Whenever you feel that stress bucket filling up, so often it's superfluous issues, things that you have no control over, and yet they fill your bucket. If you go back to your basics and you actually work out, what can I prioritize? What is within my sphere of influence to have an impact on? And then it enables you to put that one right at top priority and let the rest of the stuff go, because you can't do anything about it. And by doing it, it actually opens up your capacity. It de-stresses you because it stops that feeling of agitation of I can't cope with everything, and actually enables that focus on the task in hand. And it's something I just use in my daily life, be it sorting out emails, working through problems, or indeed living with my teenage boys. It's what can I actually control? The answer is with them, not a lot.
I think that's some great advice there. Control the controllable.
Yeah.
Now, there are people listening to this from right across the armed forces. What message would you like all personnel to reflect on as we celebrate inclusion on International Women's Day?
I just think we should all be really proud of ourselves, of how far we've come and how much we can continue to make progress. It's all around just thinking about bringing your true self to work. And the one thing I would say is the big bit we talked about there, Amy, in the middle, which was so important, was the bit that neither of us could really vocalise as well. And it's how difficult it is for everybody when we are talking about inclusion. All I can ever say is do your best, internally and externally. When you find yourself sort of thinking something, catch yourself and think, is that fair? Am I being inclusive? How can I change that to be more inclusive? As long as we're doing that, then we're always going to be moving in the right direction.
We'd like to thank Mandy Hickson for appearing on Inside Air and BFBS for their help in producing this feature.
This is Reheat, where we take a look at the RAF's contribution to NATO operations in Eastern Europe. A Royal Air Force Poseidon maritime patrol aircraft has joined other NATO ships and aircraft to locate and track Russian Navy warships in the Mediterranean Sea. Originally deployed to the region on a training exercise, the aircraft was reassigned to support a coalition of NATO warships tasked with shadowing Russian vessels. Squadron leader Dave Higgins of 120 Squadron made this statement from Mission Command. As one of the only nations within NATO with this platform, our involvement enhances the ability of the alliance to monitor Russian activity. We have a selection of the most modern, advanced and capable sensors fitted to any aircraft in the world. Our search radar, combined with our video camera and other advanced sensors that allow us to detect radars and other emissions, means we can very quickly produce a picture of exactly what's happening on the surface of the sea. The Russian warships were monitored from a discreet distance as part of the NATO collective defence mission. Elsewhere, less than 24 hours after Russian forces entered Ukraine, RAF Typhoons were in the skies as part of NATO's mission to defend Europe. The Typhoons, armed with state-of-the-art air-to-air missiles and a full suite of defensive aids, are patrolling NATO airspace over Poland and Romania. The Air Force's newest fifth-generation fighter jets have now also joined these air patrols in Eastern Europe for the first time. Armed with a variety of air-to-air and air-to-ground weapons, the state-of-the-art F-35s are capable of multiple simultaneous missions such as air defence policing, while also intelligence gathering. Both the Typhoons and F-35s are supported by RAF Voyager air-to-air refuelling, extending the duration and reach of the sorties. That's Reheat on InsideAIR.
I'm SAC's Simon Ross with this episode's Name That Noise. That was the sound of an RAF Voyager KC Mark II taking off on an air-to-air refuelling sortie. Operated by 10 Squadron and 101 Squadron from RAF Brize Norton, and based on the Airbus A330 airliner, this multi-role tanker transport aircraft has 2 Rolls-Royce Trent jet engines and 2 underwing pods for refuelling fast jet aircraft. The Voyager KC Mark III has an additional centerline hose for use by large aircraft. Fuel offloaded during air-to-air refuelling is taken from the aircraft's standard wing and fuselage tanks, leaving the cabin free for up to 291 personnel and the hold available for freight. The ability of Voyager to refuel jets mid-air extends the Typhoon's range and time they can spend on patrol. This is another way the RAF supports NATO's defence mission.
That's all for this episode of InsideAIR. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to InsideAIR, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. InsideAIR is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.